So 2 years ago, I gave a TED Talk about how fear of nuclear energy harms the environment. And that may sound like a strange thing to talk about, but I pointed out that according to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people die a premature death every year from inhaling air pollution from biomass or fossil fuels. And the climate scientist James Hansen has done a study finding that about 1.8 million people's lives have been saved by nuclear power. And I'm not going to go through my whole talk again. If you want to watch it later, it's online. I want to focus on one aspect of my talk that I didn't have enough time, I think, to give attention to, and that I want to address more specifically today, and that's the relationship between nuclear energy and nuclear bombs. In my talk, I pointed out that there's 51 nations with nuclear for energy or medicine or agriculture, but only 9 of them have nuclear weapons. So the concern that people have that, if nuclear power spreads around the world, if countries get nuclear power plants, then they're just going to go get a bomb, that hasn't turned out to be the case. So that's not the thing that we need to worry about. In fact, I pointed out that in some ways, the relationship between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons is the opposite of what we've been taught to believe. South Korea, in order to get nuclear power, had to agree to not get a weapon. And we send in international inspectors to make sure that they're not doing that with their power plants. By contrast, North Korea, they wanted nuclear power. They didn't get it. We didn't let them have it. There was other things going on, and they ended up getting a bomb instead. And you can see North Korea is impoverished and in the dark, and South Korea is brightly lit with Seoul right there in the middle. But during the last couple of years, a number of events have happened that have, I think, challenged some of our own views of this technology and made us reconsider what's really going on. And so I wanted to share some of our most latest research with you, and also some research from other scholars that I think is quite important for Europeans in particular to start to consider. The first thing is Iran. Most of you probably have heard that between 1987 and 2003, Iran did have a nuclear weapons program. They were clearly making materials that could be used in a nuclear bomb. Experts believe that they had enough materials to make about 8 nuclear bombs. The Obama administration negotiated an agreement that we thought was great to actually help them to have nuclear power with inspectors there. The Trump administration has rejected that plan, unwisely in our view, though the Europeans, including President Macron of France, are pursuing helping Iran to have a peaceful nuclear program. But still, you know that there's sort of a weapons option for them in the back of their minds. The new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia came to the United States just last May, and he was asked point blank what his country would do if Iran got a nuclear weapon, and he said, we would get a nuclear weapon too. And that was very controversial because the United States, along with China and Russia and South Korea and France, are competing to build a nuclear power plant in Saudi Arabia, and there were some questions about whether we should still do that if they might use it to get a weapon later. They're not alone in this. We see in Bangladesh as well, there's been talk that Bangladesh might want to get a nuclear weapon. Currently, Russia is building a nuclear power plant in Bangladesh. Turkey has become a really controversial country as well. Their leader is building a nuclear power plant, and many experts think that Turkey's actually getting ready to leave NATO and perhaps build its own nuclear weapon, something that has created a lot of concern and controversy. And then finally, Brazil is looking to build 2 new nuclear reactors. It has one. In the 1970s, Brazil was very interested in building a weapon, and according to a new Stratfor report, which is a very respected national security consultancy, Brazil will leave the door open to developing nuclear weapons by maintaining this atomic technology. So we just went through the list, and we found of the 26 nations building nuclear power, actually 23 of them, not 21, have expressed some interest in obtaining a weapon, have had a weapon in the past, or actually have a weapon. So you see, for most countries, that weapons option is a real thing. It's not just imagined. Well, what does all this mean for you guys and for Europeans? We're at a very interesting moment where I think the global political order is really starting to change, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, just to bring us back into some history, 1960, France tested its first atomic weapon. France and Britain, of course, are the only two countries in Europe with nuclear bombs. And in 1961, the US administration, the Kennedy administration, tried to persuade the French president, General Charles de Gaulle, to let NATO control France's nuclear weapons. That's how it works in Britain. Britain has its own weapons, but they're under NATO control. And Charles de Gaulle very famously said something like, "Would you really trade New York for Paris?" Sometimes people say, "Would you really trade Pittsburgh for Paris?" Meaning that if France were being invaded by a foreign power, would the United States really risk an atomic attack to defend its European allies? And of course, we Americans are very proud of providing this nuclear shield for much of Europe and for Asia, but I think that de Gaulle was raising a really important question, and a question that's come back very strongly now. I mean, obviously, France got invaded by Germany not just once, but twice, and they were really insistent that they needed to be able to protect themselves going forward. Just a few weeks later, the world came as close to nuclear war as it's ever come with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba. There was a naval blockade. We got very close. It was a big test of deterrence, and deterrence, of course, being the ability to scare your opponents into backing off. Eventually, the Kennedy administration secretly agreed to withdraw our missiles from Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union withdrawing those missiles from Cuba. But it was a kind of wake-up moment for everybody. And I think quite understandably then, at this jittery moment, you've seen all around the world many, many countries that have gotten nuclear power plants in the past, including some surprising ones like Sweden and Switzerland, did so with a weapons option in mind. It wasn't that they were going to get a weapon, but they thought if we have nuclear power and the science and the technical ability to manage it, we will have a weapons option later. So that's a more complex reality than I think I was able to get in a couple of years ago. Well, what is the record of nuclear weapons? They're obviously very dangerous. I mean, like, I think nuclear weapons are probably, we might agree, the most dangerous objects on Earth, the most dangerous objects certainly humans have ever created. But are they destructive? That's a different question. This is a, I think this is the best description of the effect of nuclear weapons on war. It's created by Oxford University's Our World in Data. Each of those little red dots signifies a conflict somewhere in the world. The size of the dot is how many people died in that conflict, and where it sits on the map is the death rate, the number of deaths per the population. And what you see, so you see sort of the 30 Years' War is the first circle there. The second circle next to it is the Napoleonic Wars, and then those big circles in the upper right-hand corner is World War I, World War II, and the genocide of the European Jews. And then something really interesting happens. The death toll just crashes after that. It just drops radically starting in 1945. And you can see now the death rate in wars is like half of what it was in 1400. So a lot of people might wonder, well, maybe something else was going on. Maybe it wasn't nuclear weapons. You can see here, this is 1945. This is two ways of looking at all the conflicts since 1945. A huge decline in total deaths. This is showing you civil wars where a nation got on one side or the other, and you can see a pretty steady decline. Here's a different way of looking at it by region. In red are all the conflicts in Asia, which really dominated the death toll, and in purple, the Middle East, and you can see really basically just the disappearance of wars in Europe. So what about that question? Well, it turns out that there's been some very good scholarly research now that analyzes whether these nuclear weapons actually did have a protective effect on nations. It turns out that they did. That maybe that's not so much of a surprise, but there was still a debate about, is it really nuclear weapons that's making for peace in the world, or is it something else? So they've looked at all these different countries over many decades of time, and they find that basically the chances of two nations with nuclear weapons going to war with each other basically goes to zero. Now, that doesn't mean that nuclear weapons eliminate war. There's still conflicts and there's still war, but they tend to be lower level conflicts. Famously, the United States and the Soviet Union fought conflicts with each other in places like Central America and South Africa, which is obviously terrible for the people there, but it didn't result in the big full-scale wars that we were so accustomed to in the 20th century. I think one of the great other examples of this deterrent effect is in India and Pakistan. You can see that India and Pakistan fought 3 full-scale wars, meaning that their troops were crossing borders with huge casualties each time, 1948, 1965, 1971. And then suddenly the 4th war, it's kind of called a war, it's really more of a border skirmish called the Kargil War, the number of casualties dropped by 90%. So you can even see that nuclear deterrent effect working in India and Pakistan. Well, I mentioned in my before that I gave a TED Talk 2 years ago about how how fear of nuclear power hurts the environment. Now I think we should consider how fear of nuclear proliferation can cause real destruction and damage. In 2002, President George W. Bush gave a speech where he identified 3 nations that had been pursuing nuclear weapons: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And he called them the axis of evil. And in fact, there was no relationship between these countries. In fact, Iran and Iraq had been at war with each other for a while. But he was trying to sort of create a sense of fear of nuclear proliferation. And I think you all remember what happened after that. The United States invaded Iraq, even though they had never threatened us. There was no invasion. They were not involved in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the consequences are now well known. We ended up with 450,000 Iraqi dead. That's 4 times more people than were killed in the Hiroshima bombing, which ended World War II. It spread terrorism throughout the Middle East. It worsened terrorism, and it worsened terrorism in Europe as well. And it cost $3.5 trillion. Not like that amount of money is comparable to the tragedy of those deaths. And if you wanted to sort of make an advertisement for why countries should get a nuclear bomb, then the invasion of Iraq was just about perfect for that. It didn't help that then a few years later we helped to overthrow the government of Libya, which had also given up its nuclear weapon. And so what you saw was countries that gave up their nuclear weapons program suffered military invasions and their leaders were killed. So it wasn't just a kind of a neutral thing. You can see why the president of North Korea was incentivized to then go build himself a weapon. And don't get me wrong, I live in the west coast of California. We're like the ones that could be hit by one of these things. But I'm also reminded that, well, maybe I'm pretty confident it makes it much less likely that the United States is going to invade North Korea, which would have been disastrous for the people of North Korea and South Korea. And in fact, for all of his bluster and talk, watch what people do, not what they say. You saw Donald Trump go to North Korea to have that meeting. I'm a lifelong progressive and Democrat. I voted for Hillary Clinton, but I think we were all felt much better that this relationship was ending up in diplomacy as opposed to some kind of a war. Well, before I mentioned that, I thought all of this was really important for Europeans. This is a continent that we care a lot about. I love coming here. I'm always struck by just how wealthy and clean and peaceful and wonderful it is to be here. I live in San Francisco, which also has a lot of tech wealth, but is just kind of a mess. Homeless encampments everywhere. We're not funding the schools like we need to. We've got all sorts of huge problems. And so there's been growing talk around why exactly after 73 years after World War II, is the United States still providing military protection for so much of the rest of the world? And so you saw this when Trump came to Europe, twice actually. I'll read 2 quotes from Trump, one from last year and one from this year. The first one was, "I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." And then the other one was, "Montenegro is a tiny country with a very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III, but that's the way it was set up." And I think it's easy to sort of dismiss Trump. He's probably going to lose in the next elections, and maybe things will just go back to the way they were. But there's some reasons to doubt that. A lot of analysts think that Trump, like a number of right-wing nationalist politicians in Europe, is really more of an effect than a cause. In other words, he's representing something that's going on in the globe right now. We saw it with Brexit. You see it with Trump. You see it even with the rise of left-wing politics around the world, where I think some of the older fundamental ideas are being questioned. And one of those is just how much longer is our responsibility to provide military protection going to last? Well, in response to Trump, a very famous German political scientist named Christian Hecke wrote a op-ed piece for the largest newspaper in Germany, arguing that Germany itself ought to get nuclear weapons. Obviously, extremely controversial. I think it's fair to say his opinion is in the minority, but he was raising a very fundamental question, which was, is the United States really willing to trade New York for Berlin, for example, or does Germany need to make sure it can protect itself? And that's a question that Europeans are going to have to answer for themselves, and certainly you shouldn't make your mind up based on what we say or do, but I think it's time to start to think about that and to have that conversation. Right now, Europe and some parts of the United States are actually starting to move away from nuclear energy. Nuclear plants are obviously being phased out in Germany and in some other countries, but nuclear energy is going to spread over the next decade. This is a projection that's a pretty safe projection because it's based on real-world commitments to build nuclear power plants and commitments to build nuclear power plants. And you can see that in the blue is China, in the red is Russia. They are really expanding how many places that they build their plants and building more plants for themselves. And I think that for a lot of these nations that have that weapons option, the concern has been, well, we don't want them to build a weapon. And I think the one thing that we found most reassuring, and I think even a little inspiring from the research, is that nations get a strong deterrent effect from being invaded militarily just by having nuclear power. In other words, you don't even have to get a weapon to have that protective benefit. The big study that was done said nuclear latency, that's the option to have a weapon. Nuclear latency appears to provide states with deterrence-related benefits that are distinct from actively pursuing nuclear bombs. It just turns out that countries are less likely to want to invade or attack a country that has the possibility of making a bomb in the future. So I'll just leave you with, to consider when Europe thinks about its energy future, whether there may be some benefit in maintaining the nuclear plants you have and the capacity that you have to be able to defend yourselves in the future if you need to. Right now, you are becoming extremely dependent on natural gas being imported from Russia. A second natural gas pipeline is being proposed to be built called Nord Stream 2. That would make the continent even more dependent on natural gas. And of course, that will all be magnified and accelerated if Europe moves forward to phase out its nuclear power plants. So up until now, I think many of us have considered nuclear energy to be kind of an aggressive or destructive technology. I think maybe we need to start thinking of it as being a protective one as well. Thank you very much.
Wow.